Mage Storytime, Episode 28, Angel Eyes. This is the continuing story of the Iron Goldfish, a party of role-players who awakened as mages. Our cast includes Alwi, who manipulates time with his phone; Bard, a mind and spirit mage who uses superheroes as his gods; Critical, who improves the luck of others through his own pain; Handy, a correspondence-using thief who steals items at long range; Kitty, who empowers his stickers and cats with spirits; Tello, a postmodern mage who uses a hodgepodge of skills to manipulate forces and matter; and Weeb, who uses his life skills to enhance his martial arts and Chinese medicine. It was a fairly normal week before our next meeting, with one small exception. Weeb's egg hatched. Apparently, a mage-dinosaur coupling was where Dragonborn came from, as the child was a scaly little humanoid who, as its first official act, gave a little fiery belch. Fortunately, Weeb had made magically sure that he got human intelligence rather than the father's brain. We put our heads together and tried to put a long-lasting glamour on the child so that it looked human. Webby, the name given to the child, could learn about his magical nature when he was a teenager. That would make for a good origin story. As we stood around arguing who would get to be the uncle, and therefore the bad influence, we received a telephone call. Tello picked up, and the voice on the other end of the line said, "Hello, dearie. You sound like someone in need of a favor." That shook us up a bit, but when the old lady on the phone introduced herself as the Bodhisattva, the archmage we had met at the Celestial Chorus, we relaxed a little. She said her congratulations to Weeb on his child, and offered to help us with our glamour problem. We started looking around for hidden cameras or something, but finally chalked all of this hidden knowledge shtick up to magic. The old lady said she would be happy to help us out, as long as we helped her out first. Of course. The Bodhisattva wouldn't clarify her needs until we agreed to help, but we decided she was probably pure enough to be safe. We checked beforehand that the mission didn't involve killing puppies, antagonizing our current or former allies, committing murder, optional given our group's enthusiasm, but not required, and so on. She said we wouldn't regret it, and we might even save the world. Way to bury the lead. Before we agreed, Tillo and Bard decided to get a nagging question answered. What was a Buddhist doing in the monotheistic celestial chorus? The wizened old lady informed us that she was something of a heretic, and that God's nature was the void that all things belong to. How else would non-existence imagine itself into being? This made our heads hurt a little, but it wasn't nefarious, so we decided to trust her. As a token of good faith, and at Weeb's request since he would have to leave the child with mundane humans, namely his mom, to be looked after, the Bodhisattva placed a solid glamour on the baby, making it look like a little human version of Weeb. The only concession to his red scales was his shock of red hair. The proud papa/mama thanked her, then took his bundle and went to have an interesting conversation with his mother. While he did that, the rest of us whipped up, or got allies to whip up, some documentation forging the kid's identity. The next day, the Bodhisattva met us at the digital web space attached to our shop to tell us about her mission. When we assembled, she cheerfully informed us that Pentex, the evil corporation that had tried to buy us out, then attacked us with werewolves, had somehow captured an angel, and were currently using its blood in their research and experiments. Demonic companies having access to that level of power was not good, and we agreed that something should be done about it. They had offices in the Dallas area, as well as in nearby Fort Worth, but the Chorus had no idea where the angel was being kept, other than nearby. It would probably be someplace well defended, but beyond that it was up to us to find the angel. We asked if she knew which angel it was, since we had worked with a few, but the old woman started to get cagey. After some pressing, she finally admitted it was one called Samael. Bard and Critical started cursing, and when the rest of the group gave them blank looks, they revealed that Samael was often another name for the Lightbringer, Lucifer. The Bodhisattva confirmed that he had been walking the earth since leading his rebellion, teaching humanity magic and trying, often disastrously, to guide them and to free his generals from hell. Or at least that's what legend said. We weren't sure if saving the devil made us bad guys, but we definitely didn't want any companies using Satan's blood for an ingredient. We thanked her and got started trying to track the angel down. We reached out to a bunch of our connections, from traditions to the law vampires, but there wasn't much information to be had. The vamps had heard of some potent hemoglobin being slung in the DFW area, however, and offered to set us up with a guy who knew a guy, in exchange for a minor boon. What harm could possibly come from owing vampires a favor? We agreed, and they called us back a few hours later with the name and contact information of a blood broker in the area. Before we met up with him, we also got in touch with our allies in the technocracy, who hated Pentex anyway. They told us they were aware of a Pentex connection to a military base in the area. That sounded like an easily protected, high-security type facility, but we weren't really sure. It didn't take long to find our vampiric contact, who was a shady-looking character who offered us some special vitamin B. He offered stuff mixed with heroin, with E, stuff that could make us feel like superheroes, and so on. When we asked about angel blood, though, he hissed and recoiled. "Don't talk about that shit out here, man. What's wrong with you?" "I am ignorant of most of the context that I am in," we flatly replied. "Okay, that's very honest. Let's go somewhere more private." So saying, we retired to a corner booth and began to talk turkey. The vampire offered to hook us up with some, although he didn't keep any on him. When he started talking price, Handy said we needed to make sure it was pure and not cut with something like unicorn blood. It was a complete bluff, but Handy looked enough like a stereotypical wizard, scrawny, bags under his eyes, ink stains on his fingers, etc., to be convincing. The vamp bought our story and arranged a meeting between us and his supplier so we could do a quality control test. We were supposed to meet the guy in Fort Worth. That connection seemed to guide our investigations, but never let it be said that we couldn't be thorough. We found out that Pentex had an office in downtown Dallas Bank Building, as well as their own complex in a suburban office park. We decided to check those out before we started planning to invade the U.S. military. A scan of the office turned up nothing, plus it was pretty public, so we set our sights on the suburban complex, and some quick internet sleuthing revealed that there was an R&D department that took up the top floors of one of the buildings. That was our target. We waited until after hours, then pulled our scrying mirror of Bath, the fey gift that let us look out of any bathroom mirror, and began peeking about. It took several tries before we got anything more than empty sinks. Finally, as we huddled around Tello, who held the mirror, the image coalesced into a woman bending over a sink, splashing water into her face. She straightened up, wiped her face, saw us peering out of the mirror, and screamed. Bard, thinking quickly, hit her with a mental blast that knocked her out, and presumably didn't do any permanent brain damage. Her purse had spilled out on the counter bathroom, and we saw an R&D badge in it through the mirror, so we decided this would be our best bet. Handy made us a portal, and we stepped into the bathroom. We tied the woman up, left her sitting in a stall, and Weeb took on her appearance. Then we started walking around as if we belonged there, operating on the story that we were the lady's friends and she had brought us to see her workplace. Weeb had also scanned her unconscious mind, so he had some idea of the woman's mannerisms and movements. Not enough to fool anyone who knew her, but, like our cover story, enough to convince a casual observer. We walked around the mostly empty offices, nodding at the occasional janitor or corporate drone as we passed. No one seemed to pay us much mind. From the plans we had seen online, we knew R&D took up the top several floors of the building, so we kept moving in a generally upwardly direction, and before long we had reached the top floor. It had a single long hallway leading to a suite of offices at one end, and showing a large laboratory through the windows at the side of the hallway. We thought everything was normal, until after a step or two we heard an electronic click, and a small alarm started going off. That wasn't too concerning, especially compared to the twin puffs of smoke that disgorged what could only be called demons a moment later. They had to be demons because of the horns, red skin, cloven hooves, and brimstone. They really couldn't be anything else. One of the demons confirmed its hostile intent by reaching over and cheerfully savaging the closest party member, Bard. He got his vengeance, though, when Handy opened a portal to the airspace over Rome, where it was currently raining. He checked. The rain soaked the hallway, but its proximity to the Vatican hadn't made it holy, as Handy hoped. So Bard reached out and blessed it, coating the hallway and the demons in holy water. They started to smolder, but didn't die yet. While they were distracted, Tello touched her armor. She wore the chestplate under her street clothes for just such an emergency, and opened a whirling vortex to the Cloaca Dentata dimension. The sucking wind pulled both off balance, but the demons clawed a hole in the floor. As both started to lose their grip, the hindmost grabbed his ally by the heel and threw him into the opening, causing it to snap shut. While the demon was distracted by the screams of torment of its partner, Kitty dashed over and slapped a sticker on it, forcing the demon into a state of deep depression and ennui. I don't know what demons get depressed about. Maybe the general presence of hope and optimism in the universe. Whatever it was, the demon turned, looked at us, slumped its shoulders, and started to cry. Then Tello pulled the temperance card from her tarot deck and forced the demon to contemplate its existence and the validity of its emotions, becoming temperate and introspective as it was morally improved by its suffering and hardships. Finally, in a last blast, a wounded bard summoned the big blue Boy Scout and activated the power of super empathy. He walked over, put a friendly arm on the shaking demon's shoulder, and asked what was wrong. We stayed there for a few minutes while the demon talked about not being appreciated in hell, and the general lack of nurturing support throughout its life, and thus the need for it to be supportive and kind to others. With a final shriek, the demon achieved enlightenment and spiritual fulfillment, and evaporated in a puff of good karma. Those of us with spirit sight could see its soul floating nearby, which thanked us for removing it from the demonic state. We took a few minutes to pump Steve the Soul, for such was his name, for information. He was very helpful. They hadn't had any angels in the lab, but he had definitely smelled some funny blood being experimented on there. It smelled off, somehow, but he never had any, so he couldn't say much about it. We looked around the lab and found a few shipping containers with Fort Worth labels on them, as well as some that referred to a military base, so that was probably where our wandering angel was. Regardless, we knew the celestial being wasn't here, so we wished the soul a lucky reincarnation and went through one of Handy's portals back to our store. At least we knew where to strike now, the military base in Fort Worth. That only left us the problem of how to get in. Fortunately, Bard used to teach in the area, so he knew a bit of the surrounding environs. We came up with several different plans, most of which involved explosions, but they were all vetoed for reasons of practicality. Not that our final plan didn't involve explosions. We had a reputation to maintain after all. Part 1 of the plan was to make our way onto the base. We determined that the easiest way to do this would be to abduct and impersonate a few low-level grunts. Probably not soldiers, but maintenance personnel or grounds crew should be sufficiently innocuous. Before we grabbed them, we found a map of the facility online, and Tello and Weeb used their matter magic to try and get some underground sonar images, or the closest magical equivalent, looking for secret sub-basements and facility-type structures. There were plenty of basements, but nothing stood out. We also noted a chapel inside, which was where we would probably try to keep Satan confined if we were in charge. With these preliminaries in mind, we waited at a mid-tier restaurant down the street from the base's main gate. We didn't have to wait long for some service personnel to show up, and one light assault later we had our disguises. Weeb flesh-crafted his own and Bard's visages to match those of our victims, who were left tied up in the back of a rented van where several of the others waited. Tello and Kitty ghosted. Tello had recently taught Kitty how, but for some reason he looked like a kid in a white sheet with holes for eyes. And they joined Weeb and Bard as they drove to the base. We had the proper identification, so Bard didn't need to use the Jedi mind trick. But he did anyway, because what's the point of having power if you don't abuse it from time to time? The guard only drooled a little as we drove away. Once they were in the base, the quartet, 3 of whom had spirit sight, drove around looking for demonic presences. Although we didn't know if this Lucifer was necessarily evil, or if that was just stories, so we weren't just looking for evil vibes. All we were certain of was that he would be a powerful presence. We checked out the chapel first and were a bit surprised to find it resonating with true faith. Maybe something to do with the old saying about atheists and foxholes. After some inspection, nothing indicated a demonic presence like we expected, so we moved on to the facilities toward the center of the base, looking for suspicious activity. Which is to say, we drove around while Tello hung her head out of the window like a dog and sensed the nearby buildings. Fortunately, she was a ghost and therefore invisible to most people, but we still felt silly nonetheless. It was at pretty much the exact center of the base that we noticed something odd. There had been several warded buildings around the base, but we figured the military probably had an entire magical division. Still, as we approached one of them, all of us started to feel a bit less inhibited, and a bit hornier. This was especially weird for Tello, who was asexual. We realized that this must be the rebellious, sexy Lucifer rather than the Prince of Darkness. Or maybe it was the Prince of Darkness, but he was probably really sexy and charming. And maybe British. Tello guided us to one particular building, which we couldn't find labeled on the map. When we approached, the door plaque read, Auxiliary Visitor Center. This was odd, as we were in the middle of the base, surrounded by offices that were best described as facilities. Not really a guest-friendly place, unlike the main visitor center, which was by the front. We were immediately suspicious. Before we entered, we contacted the party members outside of the compound telepathically and had them use the MacGuffin stones to teleport to us in the van, and always had a save point. Kitty and Tello resumed physical form, since they couldn't go through the warded building, and we prepared to go in. Except for Weeb. We told Weeb to take a walk. He drove the van north to the edge of the lake to start a distraction. Sitting in the car, he reached out with his magic and caused one of the fuel tanks they used for fueling jets there to leak. As oil dribbled out onto the lake's surface, he tossed a cigarette and the lake ignited. Somewhere, Bard heard Captain Planet scream. That drew the attention of the entire base, and within moments military and civilian personnel were either evacuating, moving to aid the fire department, or watching in awe as the lake blazed. Distraction provided, we moved into the auxiliary visitor center, figuring that anyone left inside probably wasn't normal. Our party was greeted by a man in fatigues, and when he questioned us, we claimed we were there for the concert. We tried to insist, and Bard reinforced his assertions with some mind magic, which did the trick. He believed that there was indeed a concert, but not that it should be set up at the auxiliary visitor center. They didn't do events here. They only made pamphlets. When we asked for a pamphlet, he refused, saying they didn't have any in stock. That was when they asked us to leave. A frustrated Bard hit the guard with a mind blast and caught him before he hit the ground. We stashed him under his desk and made our way into the corridors beyond. At the lake, the fire raged out of control. Once beyond the door, we were immediately set back by the bland, unassuming appearance of the office corridors in a mass-manufactured building. About the same time, we noticed that the hallway looked like a generic office hallway, and we had no idea where we were going. Alarms started going off. Critical pointed out the security cameras that had seen our mystical assault and unlawful entry. Oops. The alarms distracted us, so did the fact that all of us had raging erections. Especially Tello, which was a bit unusual for her. Something about Satan's lascivious or uninhibited or whatever aura was affecting us. We figured out pretty quickly that it was coming from the basement, and we set off looking for it. Our pace was quickened by the distant sound of shouting and running feet, and we started throwing doors open looking for the stairs down. The first few were empty, then Critical threw open a door to expose two guys in suits playing cards. They looked up and said, "Who the fuck are you?" The lake is on fire and they need your help." "What? Bullshit." They started to rise, and Handy reached into his bag to pull out a few sheets of paper towels, which he tossed into the laps of the pair. They were surprised by the towels, and even more surprised by the sudden increase in gravity in their crotch regions, as Handy magically increased the gravity of the paper towels, pinning them in. As we saw them start to force their way up anyway, Tello slammed the door shut and fused it with the surrounding jam. A few moments later, we heard a lot of snarling and scratching at the door. Oh good, Pentex werewolves. At the lake, fireballs started to erupt out of the blaze, directed by an unseen weeb. None of the mortal observers were sure how they formed, although scientists and technicians would debate for weeks to come. But they seemed to be landing exclusively on the base, almost like an attack. Ensconced in the van, Weeb cackled madly. More doors were open, and a few solitary individuals were locked inside, until we at last tumbled out onto the landing of the stairwell, straight into the path of the 5 armed guards. Seeing as these were Pentex goons rather than honest soldiers, we didn't pull any punches. Tello opened by reaching out with a crystal and making several arcane gestures, creating a bubble of air around the men and then burning the air out of it. A ripple of flame washed over the toughs, fire pulling the air from their very lungs, as the oxygen in a large sphere was burned away. They started to gasp and claw at their throats in a panic, then always slowed them with time magic to prolong their exposure. This was not a healthy turn of events for the guards. One of the quintet was knocked down by a mind blast from Bard, who didn't want to close to melee since there was no oxygen there. Spurred by this, the goons returned fire, or at least 2 of them did, and suffocated for their efforts. Also, we shot them. Unfortunately, their shots were well aimed, if not well thought out, and Critical and Bard each took a round in the arm and the side, respectively. They weren't too badly hurt, but they weren't happy. The other 2 guards fell back and quickly escaped the airless sphere, leaving them gasping for air on the stairwell. Handy reached into his bag, yelled, "Catch!" and made a throwing gesture at one of them. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to throw out slipped out of his grasp on the other side of his magic portal, so he didn't actually retrieve or throw anything. Fortunately, one of the goons was a flinchy sort, and jerked back on reflex, accidentally throwing himself down the stairs in a bone-crunching series of impacts. Critical rushed forward, holding his breath through the airless zone, and swung his sap at the final goon's face. The man dodged back successfully, but started to lose his balance on the step and wobbled precariously. Critical booped him in the snoot, and the man went over backwards, landing in a bloody heap at the bottom of the stairs next to his comrade. We shot them a few times just to be sure, then made our way through the door at the bottom of the stairs. The massive room was dimly lit and filled with scientific instruments and surgical equipment. Men and women in lab coats and technicians' jumpers stood about, staring at us. In the center of the room hung suspended an absolutely beautiful naked man, pipes and tubes running out of him into collection basins. Then the demons popped out of the back room and the fight was on. 5 large men wearing technicians' outfits moved between us and the quartet of obvious scientists. The 5 men, who had the look of henchmen about them, each grabbed vials of a pinkish liquid from inside their tunics and downed them. Then they grew visibly larger and started to move towards us. Handy shouted, "Drop your weapons or I'll send you into the sun!" He couldn't actually send them that far, but they didn't know that. To help his bluff, he held up a small portal opened into a particularly bright patch of Death Valley. It's hard to tell whether or not his bluff would have worked, because the people in the coats immediately hissed and started to burn in the sunlight. Damn vampires just keep turning up everywhere. They're worse than cockroaches. Critical ran over and engaged one goon in melee, trading blows for a few moments before he grabbed a man's head and whispered in his ear. Critical was crestfallen when the man shook off his geesh. He gritted his teeth, poured his will into his voice, and snarled, "Fight your friends!" It worked the second time, and we had a surprise ally. For his part, Bard tried to summon his guardian superhero, but the boyish alter ego of the big red cheese was a bit too innocent and pure to manifest near Lucifer's overpowering naughtiness. So instead, Bard started hurling mind bolts around, blasting a few of the goon squad before they were among our party. While Bard held the mooks at bay, and then provided a distraction by being swarmed by vengeful henchmen, Tello took advantage of the opening to make eye contact with the man on the suspended rack. He winked and waved at her. She pulled a crystal from a belt pouch and, with some gestures and muttered words, began to put stress on the minute fractures and breaks in the man's manacles. The wards and locks had been more designed to keep someone in than out, so she had a fairly easy time getting them to snap, whereupon the man fell to the floor with a thump. He stood up and stretched, making sure that Tello got a good look at his exposed manhood. She did her best to look away, much to his amusement. Then the man said something about payback and started laying into the vampire scientists. They started chanting and gesticulating at him, but he laughed as multicolored sparks flew off of him and kept coming. When he literally knocked the first one's head off, we remembered that Lucifer was a big-time angel/demon/being, and was therefore probably pretty good in a fight. Well, actually, Weeb later saw him fighting and pointed out that the devil was a pretty mediocre combatant. He was just so damn powerful it really didn't matter. About that time, the demons left over the intervening bodies and landed among our group. All we reacted first and landed a flurry of punches on the demon's crotch. The demon stared at him for a moment, then muttered, "Nothing there, friend. Sorry." Always shoulders sank. Bard, in the meanwhile, had been heroically assaulting the electrified batons of the goons with his soft, squishy body, and was paying the price for his attempts to be a frontline fighter without using his superheroes. He took a few wild swings, enough to force the hoods to step back and give him some space, and muttered, "I'm the best there is at what I do." This hero wasn't bothered by Lucifer's interference field, and was able to help heal Bard pretty quickly. Now that he had a warrior spirit, he started having a better time of the fight. Kitty helped by slapping a sticker on one of the goons, forcing his body and soul apart. When Kitty saw that the soul, like the man, looked roided out and had a weird pinkish cast to his throbbing veins, he looked around and noticed a similar colored substance in some of the jars on the tables in the lab, and in the tubes that had been in Lucifer. He cheerfully informed us that our opponents were hopped up on devil blood. The same was probably true of the vampires, but Lucifer was taking them apart like they were made of Lego, so that was of a lesser concern. Our backup, Weeb, was ignoring our telepathic calls for help. Well, actually, he heard the call and sank into a martial arts stance. In recent weeks, he had upgraded his Astartes Fu, so this time, when he has swelled to his enlarged bulk, he kept going and turned green in hue. He then became an orc in power armor, and with a cry of "Wah!" he activated the MacGuffin stone and came through the portal swinging. As he landed, his massive choppa, more a vaguely wedge-shaped hunk of metal than an actual blade, ripped through one of the remaining guards. Handy shot another with an arrow, while the last was tackled by our quisling friend, and the two men fell in a tangle of limbs and batons. That only left the demons to deal with. Only. One of the red infernal creatures lashed out at Bard, but he was empowered by his hero and dodged fairly easily. Weeb didn't dodge when another attacked him, but he really didn't need to. His armor and muscles stopped the demon's claws after barely a scratch, and he laughed. Alwee wasn't as quick or hardy, however, and got several large gashes across his torso. As he fell, he gasped at Tello, who stood nearby, to stab him in the face and reset time if things got bad. She managed to keep a straight face as she promised she would somehow manage to find a way to do it to a comrade. As he slumped to the floor, Tello instead decided it was time to bug out and ripped open a portal to the spirit world. There wasn't really any defenses there, as the lab had been set up in a pre-existing government facility and hadn't really had time to arm its umbral counterparts, since they'd only been in the residence for a few weeks. Tello yeeted the unconscious Alwee through the portal, then invited Lucifer to run with us. He agreed, but suggested me might want to destroy the lab, since it contained both his blood and notes about it. We agreed, and Tello asked for volunteers. Weeb let loose a wah! As the rest of us made a mad dash for the portal, Weeb transmogrified his massive 30-pound choppa, changing its makeup from metal to sharpened C4. Then he raced past the demons and slammed the explosive into one of the pillars near the rack, and sensitive-looking equipment, at the back of the lab. Then he turned and ran hell-bent for leather for the portal. Everyone else was inside by this point, and Kitty held it open while a superpowered bard held the entrance to the spirit world against the demons trying to follow us in. It got easier when Handy stole him a gallon jug of holy water from some bulk sale church, and Bard hit the demons with it. They started to convulse and shudder, leaving the entryway clear. Alwee was lying unconscious on the ground, while a helpful and naked Lucifer, who had apparently learned a lot of things over the years, treated his wounds. The only problem was that Lucifer's junk was flopping around and definitely touched Alwee multiple times. Kitty made sure to take pictures to share with his brother later. As Weeb ran flat out for the portal, Tello used her crystal and turned the oxygen into the lab into methane. Weeb threw himself into a dive, flying past the thrashing demons, and Tello threw a lit Zippo into the room as Kitty closed the portal. We heard a loud whump of explosion just before the gate sealed shut, and we found ourselves safely in the spirit world. Lucifer, in between rounds of flirting with Weeb and Tello, to his enjoyment and her chagrin, led us out of the military sector and into the larger umbral realms, then thanked us for saving him. He said someone must have spiked his coke, which allowed the goons to take him from behind. We chose not to ask for any clarification, letting the double entendres stand. He did confirm that he wasn't really the Prince of Evil, more a tempter who worked for God and did the unpleasant jobs, and generally encouraged free-spiritedness. We all got a feeling of freedom and excess from him, as opposed to anger or evil, so we figured he was probably on the level. Although Alwee was still concerned about having been touched by the devil's dick. Or anyone's dick, really. Lucifer pointed out that if it was good enough for Anthony and Cleopatra, it was good enough for him, and left us, strutting off to take vengeance against Pentex. We decided we didn't have to worry about them anymore. Do the iron goldfish have to worry? Can they really trust the devil? Will Alwee's fragile manhood ever recover? Find out in the next Mage Storytime.